Rain lashed the windshield, drowning out the radio's grim news. He was 10 miles away from a salary that would keep a roof over his daughter's head, sweating inside a thrift store suit that smelled faintly of mothballs. Then he saw the smoke. Stopping meant financial ruin. He hit the brakes anyway. The polyester collar was a slow, abrasive saw against Thomas Riley's neck. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror, fingers fumbling with a necktie that felt like a noose. The apartment smelled of burnt toast and the acidic tang of cheap, lemon-scented floor cleaner. It was a smell that clawed at the back of his throat, a constant reminder of the security deposit he was desperately trying to keep. "Daddy, the milk smells funny." Thomas paused, dropping the half-knotted tie. He stepped out of the cramped bathroom and into the kitchenette. His 6-year-old daughter, Sadie, sat at a chipped Formica table, staring suspiciously into a plastic bowl of off-brand Cheerios. He picked up the milk carton, sniffed it, and winced. The sour, heavy odor of rot hit his sinuses. "You're right, Bug. It's gone. Don't eat that." He snatched the bowl away, dumping it into the sink where it joined a small mountain of unwashed coffee mugs. He grabbed a bruised apple from the counter, polished it on the sleeve of his white dress shirt, and handed it to her. "Breakfast on the go today. Get your coat." He checked his watch. 7:45 a.m. The interview for the regional supply chain manager position at Sterling Croft Industries, Croft Logistics, was at 9 a.m. It was a 40-minute drive on a good day. Today, the sky over the city was a bruised, swollen purple, dumping sheets of freezing rain onto the asphalt. Thomas shoved his arms into the suit jacket. It was a dark navy, a size too big in the shoulders and a size too small in the chest. He felt like a child playing dress-up, an imposter attempting to sneak into the white-collar world. For the last 4 years, his uniform had been oil-stained Dickies and steel-toed boots. He knew the internal architecture of a transmission better than he knew Microsoft Excel. But his knees were giving out, and a mechanic's wage barely covered Sadie's asthma inhalers, let alone the rising rent. He needed this desk job. He needed the dental plan. He needed to not wake up at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling, doing brutal, terrifying math in his head. After dropping Sadie off at Mrs. Gable's apartment down the hall, a cramped space smelling heavily of wet dog and boiled cabbage, Thomas sprinted to his 2008 Honda Civic. The driver's side door screamed in metallic protest as he yanked it open. The interior was freezing, the heater core having died 2 winters ago. He merged onto the interstate. The rain was a relentless drumbeat against the roof. The windshield wipers smeared the water more than they cleared it, emitting a high-pitched rubbery squeal that set his teeth on edge. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned the color of old bone. "Just get there," he told himself, rehearsing his interview answers aloud. "My background in practical logistics gives me a unique boots-on-the-ground perspective regarding supply chain bottlenecks." It sounded hollow, fake. At 8:30 a.m., he was making good time. The traffic was heavy but moving. He was going to make it. He let out a long, ragged exhale, feeling the knot in his stomach loosen just a fraction. Then he saw the hazard lights. A sleek black Audi A8 was pulled over on the narrow, crumbling shoulder of the overpass. Thick white steam billowed aggressively from beneath its hood, mingling with the heavy rain. A woman stood outside the car, huddled under a flimsy designer umbrella that the wind was actively trying to tear from her grip. She was wearing a beige trench coat, and even from 100 yards away, Thomas could see the spray of mud from passing semi-trucks coating her calves. Thomas's foot hovered over the brake pedal. "Don't do it," his brain screamed. "Keep driving. You are wearing your only suit. You have an interview in 30 minutes. You have $12 in your checking account." He watched a massive 18-wheeler fly past the stranded woman. The backdraft caught her umbrella, snapping the frame inside out. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the guardrail. Thomas cursed. It was a sharp, ugly word that hung in the freezing air of his car. He hated himself for it. He hated the deeply ingrained, blue-collar compulsion that made it impossible for him to ignore a broken machine and a desperate person. He wrenched the steering wheel to the right, tires hydroplaning for a terrifying second, before biting into the gravel of the shoulder. He pulled up behind the Audi, slammed the shifter into park, and hit his own hazards. 5 minutes, he told himself, staring at the clock on the dash. I'll just make sure she's got a tow coming. 5 minutes. When Thomas stepped out of the Honda, the cold hit him like a physical blow. The rain immediately plastered his hair to his forehead and seeped through the thin fabric of his suit shoulders. He jogged toward the Audi, his cheap dress shoes slipping on the slick, oily sheen of the wet highway. The woman was frantically tapping at the screen of her phone, wiping away raindrops that registered as phantom touches on the glass. She looked up as Thomas approached, her expression instantly hardening into a mask of defensive hostility. "I have a tow truck coming," she said loudly over the roar of the highway. Her voice was sharp, accustomed to cutting through noise and commanding attention. She looked to be in her late 30s, with sharp cheekbones and dark hair that had entirely escaped its severe updo, now plastered against her neck. The beige trench coat was ruined, splattered with gray highway sludge. "Are you sure?" Thomas shouted back, gesturing toward her phone. "Because out here, in this weather, a tow is going to take 3 hours, and you're standing 3 feet from the active lane." "I told you. I'm fine. Please, just—" She waved a hand at him, a gesture that was dismissive and distinctly aristocratic. "Leave. I don't need assistance." Thomas felt a spike of genuine irritation. He was risking his daughter's future for this woman's safety, and she was treating him like a panhandler. He looked at the steam hissing violently from the Audi's grill. "Pop the hood," he demanded. "Excuse me?" "The hood latch. Pull it. Before your engine block warps, and a $300 repair turns into a $10,000 engine replacement. Pull the damn latch, lady." She blinked, momentarily stunned by his tone, before turning and reaching into the open driver's side door. A muffled thwack sounded from the front of the car. Thomas didn't wait. He approached the grill. The metal was scalding hot. He found the secondary catch, wrapped his bare hand in the hem of his suit jacket to protect his skin, and shoved the hood up. A cloud of white steam engulfed him. The smell was instant and overwhelming, the sickly sweet syrupy stench of boiling ethylene glycol. Antifreeze. Thomas waved the steam away, coughing as the chemical vapor burned the back of his throat. He leaned over the engine bay, the rain drumming furiously against his back. He traced the cooling system with his eyes. The engine block was a massive, intimidating V8, covered in plastic vanity shields. But the plumbing was universal. It took him 10 seconds to find the problem. The upper radiator hose had completely blown off the housing. The clamp, a cheap plastic and metal composite, had fractured. "It's your upper hose," Thomas yelled, backing away from the heat. The woman had stepped closer, holding her ruined umbrella like a shield. "Can you fix it?" Her tone was less abrasive now, edged with a creeping, desperate panic. "I have a board meeting in 45 minutes. I cannot be stuck on this highway." "I don't have a spare hose clamp for an Audi in my pocket," Thomas snapped, wiping freezing rain from his eyes. He looked down at his clothes. The front of his white shirt was already speckled with brown, greasy droplets of coolant. He looked at his watch. 8:43 a.m. If he got back in his car right now, drove like a madman, he would walk into the lobby of Croft Logistics exactly at 9 a.m., looking like a drowned rat. It was a guaranteed rejection, but it was a chance. He looked at the woman. She was shivering, her lips taking on a faint blue tint. Thomas let out an exhausted, guttural breath. "Hold on." He ran back to his Civic, popped the trunk, and dug past a pile of discarded toys and jumper cables until he found his emergency toolbox. It was a heavy, dented metal box that smelled of rust and WD-40. He grabbed a heavy-duty stainless steel worm gear clamp, a flathead screwdriver, and a thick roll of industrial silicone tape. Running back to the Audi, he didn't bother speaking. He leaned deep into the engine bay. The heat radiating from the metal was intense, cooking the rain off his jacket. He grabbed the rubber hose. It was scalding. He gritted his teeth, suppressing a hiss of pain, and muscled the thick rubber back onto the aluminum radiator neck. His hand slipped. His knuckles slammed hard against the sharp edge of the cooling fan housing. The skin tore instantly. Thomas swore, pulling his hand back. A thick ribbon of crimson blood mixed with the green coolant, dripping down his wrist and staining the stark white cuff of his dress shirt. "Oh my God, you're bleeding," the woman said, stepping forward. "It's fine," Thomas grunted, ignoring the stinging, pulsing pain. He wrapped the silicone tape tight around the seam, overlapping it to create a seal, then slid the stainless steel clamp over the tape. He used the flathead screwdriver to crank the clamp down until the metal bit deeply into the rubber. "That'll hold," Thomas said, stepping back and dropping the screwdriver into his pocket. He wiped his bloody, grease-stained hand on his dark trousers. "But you lost a lot of coolant. You can't drive it far. Take the next exit, go to the gas station, and buy 2 gallons of 50-50 mix. Pour it in the reservoir, not the radiator cap. Then take it to a shop." He slammed the hood down. The woman stood staring at him. She looked from his bleeding, grease-blackened hands to his soaked, ruined suit. She reached into her trench coat and pulled out a sleek leather wallet. "Please," she said, pulling out a thick sheaf of bills. "Hundreds. Let me pay you for your time. Your suit." Thomas looked at the money. It was more cash than he had seen in 3 months. It could pay the rent. It could buy Sadie new winter boots. But looking at it made a bitter, acidic pride rise in his chest. He wasn't a roadside servant. He was a man who had just thrown away his last chance at a decent life. "Keep it," Thomas said, his voice flat, deadened by the rain and the crushing weight of reality. "Buy a better umbrella." He turned his back on her, walking back to his Civic. He climbed inside, shivering violently, and slammed the door. He didn't look back as he pulled into traffic. He glanced at the dashboard clock. 9:12 a.m. He missed it. He missed the interview. Thomas rested his forehead against the freezing plastic of the steering wheel, the smell of burnt coolant and his own blood filling the tiny cabin. For the first time in years, he closed his eyes and let a single, hot tear of pure defeat slide down his cheek. The evening was a study in depression. The walls of Thomas's apartment seemed to press inward, suffocating him. The smell of cheap powdered cheese from the macaroni he'd boiled for Sadie lingered in the humid air. She was asleep now, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit, oblivious to the fact that her father had spent the last 4 hours staring at a pile of unpaid utility bills. He sat on the sagging sofa, a glass of tap water in his hand, feeling the dull, throbbing ache in his bandaged knuckles. His phone sat on the coffee table, a black rectangle of judgment. He had called Croft Logistics at 9:30 a.m. from the highway shoulder, stammering an apology to a deeply unimpressed receptionist. "I'm sorry, Mr. Riley," the woman had said, her voice dripping with professional boredom. "But the hiring manager's schedule is strictly locked. Punctuality is a core metric for this role. We will keep your resume on file." It was a polite execution. Thomas leaned back, closing his eyes. The texture of the cheap corduroy sofa scratched against his neck. He felt heavy. He felt like a man treading water in a dark ocean, realizing his legs were finally too tired to kick. Tomorrow, he would have to call the garage on 4th Street and beg for his old job back. He'd have to go back to the bone-deep ache, the perpetual smell of gasoline in his pores, the constant fear of being one blown tire away from homelessness. At 7 a.m. the next morning, the phone rang. Thomas jolted awake on the sofa, his neck cramped. He blinked at the bright screen. It was an unknown number. He swiped to answer, his voice gravelly with sleep. "Hello? Thomas Riley?" It was a man's voice, crisp, cold, precise. "Speaking. My name is David. I am calling from the executive office of Croft Logistics. We are requesting your presence at our downtown headquarters at 9 o'clock this morning." Thomas frowned, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Look, I already spoke to reception yesterday. I know I missed my slot. I had an emergency on the highway. This is not regarding the regional supply chain manager position, Mr. Riley," the voice interrupted smoothly. "This is a direct request from the chief executive officer. Security will have a badge waiting for you. Good day." The line went dead. Thomas stared at the phone. His heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The CEO? It had to be a mistake, a bureaucratic mix-up. Maybe they were auditing applicants. Maybe it was some weird corporate humiliation tactic. But you didn't say no to a summons from the top of the food chain. Not when you were starving. An hour later, Thomas stood in the lobby of the Croft Logistics Tower. The building was a monolith of glass, steel, and intimidating wealth. The air smelled of filtered ozone, expensive floor wax, and the subtle, lingering scent of artisanal espresso. It was a sterile, silent environment that made Thomas hyper-aware of his own presence. He hadn't bothered with the suit today. It was ruined, hanging in his bathroom covered in grease and blood. Instead, he wore his cleanest pair of dark denim jeans, scuffed brown boots, and a heavy gray flannel shirt. The bandage on his hand was glaringly white. He looked exactly like what he was, a mechanic who had wandered into the wrong tax bracket. The security guard, a man with an earpiece and eyes like flint, handed him a temporary badge without a word and pointed him toward the private elevator bank. The ride up was silent, the elevator moving so fast it made Thomas's stomach drop. When the brushed steel doors slid open, he stepped onto a thick, charcoal gray carpet that absorbed all sound. A sleek reception desk sat in the center of the room. The man sitting behind it, presumably David, stood up. He looked Thomas up and down, his eyes lingering for a microsecond on the flannel shirt before gesturing toward a set of massive, heavy mahogany double doors at the end of the hall. "She is waiting for you, Mr. Riley. Go right in." Thomas walked toward the doors, the silence of the floor pressing against his eardrums. The brass handles were cold and heavy. He pushed them open. The office was absurdly large. 2 walls were entirely floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a dizzying panoramic view of the gray city skyline. Rain was still spitting against the glass, tracing erratic paths down the panes. The air smelled of expensive leather and rain. In the center of the room sat a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single slab of black marble. Sitting behind it, typing furiously on a slim laptop, was a woman in a sharply tailored charcoal blazer. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, flawless updo. She stopped typing and looked up. It was her, the woman from the highway. Thomas froze. The breath rushed out of his lungs. He stared at her sharp cheekbones, the aristocratic tilt of her chin. She leaned back in her ergonomic leather chair, steepling her fingers. Her eyes, sharp and evaluating, locked onto his. "You didn't take the money, Thomas," she said. Her voice was no longer frantic or panicked. It was calm, measured, and held the absolute authority of someone who owned everything she could see. Thomas swallowed hard, his throat dry. "You're the CEO." "I am Claire Croft," she said, standing up. She walked around the marble desk, her heels clicking against a hardwood section of the floor. "And yesterday you cost yourself a job at my company to fix a blown radiator hose on a car that didn't belong to you. For a woman who was profoundly rude to you." She stopped a few feet away, her eyes dropping to the white bandage on his knuckle. "I reviewed your application file last night," Claire continued, crossing her arms. "Your resume is a mess. You have a massive gap in your corporate employment history. Your Excel skills are rudimentary at best. On paper, you are completely unqualified to manage a logistics division." Thomas felt a hot flush of anger rise in his neck, burning away his initial shock. He hadn't come here to be mocked. He tightened his jaw. "If you brought me up here to humiliate me for stopping to help you, you can save your breath. I know I missed the interview. I know I'm not a corporate suit. I'll see myself out." He turned on his heel, reaching for the heavy mahogany door. "I didn't bring you here to humiliate you, Mr. Riley." Claire's voice snapped out like a whip, freezing him in place. "I brought you here because the man I fired yesterday, the man whose job you were applying for, had a flawless resume. He went to Wharton. He wore $3,000 suits." Thomas slowly turned back around. She was watching him intently. "He also," Claire said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, "hid a supply chain collapse in our Midwest sector for 3 months because he was afraid of looking bad, nearly costing this company $20 million. She took a step closer to Thomas. He could smell her perfume now, something sharp, clean, and fiercely expensive, like crushed cedar and bergamot. "I can teach someone how to use a spreadsheet, Thomas," Claire said, her eyes boring into his. "I can buy them a suit. What I cannot teach is the instinct to pull over on a freezing highway, burn your own hands on a hot engine block, and sacrifice your own future to fix a broken system just because you can't stand to watch it fail." She walked back to her desk, picked up a thick manila folder, and tossed it onto the black marble. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. "That," Claire said, "is a partner-level contract. It bypasses the managerial level entirely. You won't be managing a region. You'll be managing the mechanics of my entire domestic supply chain. You report directly to me." Thomas stared at the folder. The room seemed to tilt slightly. The air in his lungs felt too thin. "Partner?" he choked out. The word tasted alien on his tongue. "You're offering me a partnership? Based on duct tape and a hose clamp?" "I'm offering you a partnership based on the fact that when everything goes to hell, you don't panic and you don't look away," Claire said flatly. "You roll up your sleeves and you stop the bleeding." She looked pointedly at his bandaged hand. "Sometimes literally." She pulled a silver pen from a holder and set it on top of the folder. "Read it over," she said. "The starting base salary is on page 2. It should cover whatever it is you need covered." Thomas walked slowly toward the desk. His boots felt like they were made of lead. He reached out with his good hand, his fingers trembling slightly as he flipped the heavy cardstock cover open. He looked at page 2. He saw a number. He blinked. He closed his eyes, squeezed them shut, and opened them again. The number was still there. It wasn't a salary. It was a rescue. It was Sadie's inhalers, a heated apartment, a college fund, and a new life, printed in neat Black Times New Roman font. He looked up at Claire Croft. She wasn't smiling, but the harsh, defensive edges of her face had softened. Beneath the armor of the billionaire CEO, he saw a flicker of the woman from the highway, tired, stressed, and deeply grateful. "Why?" Thomas asked, his voice cracking. It was a raw, imperfect sound. "You could have just given me a check. You could have given me the manager job." "Because I don't need a manager, Thomas," Claire said softly, turning to look out the rain-streaked window at the sprawling city below. "I need someone who isn't afraid to get their hands dirty. And frankly, I have a feeling you're the only person in this building who would actually tell me when my engine is smoking." The first month felt like wearing another man's skin. Thomas bought 3 off-the-rack suits with his first advance. They were decent wool, tailored to fit, but he hated the way the fabric gripped his shoulders. He missed the heavy, protective weight of his canvas work jacket. He missed the smell of grease. The executive floor of Croft Logistics smelled of ozone, dry cleaning fluid, and cold, sanitized power. It made his teeth ache. His office was a glass box on the 42nd floor. It contained a dual-monitor setup he barely understood and an ergonomic chair that made his lower back scream. He spent the first 3 weeks drowning in a language he didn't speak. Synergies, downstream metrics, capital expenditures. The other executives, men and women with Ivy League pedigrees and pale, uncalloused hands, looked at him like he was a stray dog Claire had dragged in from the rain. They smiled with their teeth, but their eyes were flat and calculating. He didn't belong here. Every time he booted up his computer, the imposter syndrome clawed at his chest, hot and suffocating. Then came the Q3 operational review. The boardroom was a long expanse of polished cherry wood. 14 executives sat around it, nursing mineral waters and tapping on iPads. The air was thick with tension. The company's largest distribution hub in Chicago was failing. Freight was bottlenecking. Delivery times had plummeted by 40%, and penalties from major retail clients were bleeding the quarterly profits dry. Richard Hayes, the VP of Operations, stood at the head of the table. He was a tall man with a perfect haircut and a suit that cost more than Thomas's old Civic. Richard clicked a laser pointer at a complex color-coded line graph on the projector screen. "The core issue," Richard said smoothly, his voice a practiced, hypnotic baritone, "is a localized disruption in our algorithmic routing protocols, compounded by anomalous seasonal volume. We are implementing a top-down software patch to streamline the loading dock queue. It should re-optimize the flow within 60 days. Thomas stared at the slide. Then he looked at the printed manifest report sitting in front of him. He had been up until 3 a.m. the night before, tracing the alphanumeric codes on the Chicago manifests like he used to trace frayed wiring harnesses under a dashboard. The math didn't lie. "That's a load of crap," Thomas said. The words slipped out before he could stop them. The boardroom plunged into a dead, horrifying silence. 14 heads snapped toward him. At the far end of the table, Claire Croft sat motionless, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. Her expression was unreadable. Richard lowered his laser pointer. A patronizing, tight-lipped smile stretched across his face. "I'm sorry, Thomas. Did you have a question regarding the algorithm?" "No," Thomas said. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. He felt the familiar, ugly spike of defensive anger, the blue-collar rage of a man being lied to by a guy in a nicer shirt. He didn't know the corporate rules, so he fell back on the only thing he understood: the mechanics of the machine. Thomas stood up. He grabbed his stack of manifests and threw them onto the center of the polished cherry wood table. They slid, scattering across the surface. "Your software is fine," Thomas grated out, his voice harsh in the quiet room. "Your algorithm is doing exactly what you built it to do. It's maximizing routes to the minute. The problem is, your algorithm thinks it's driving the trucks." Richard frowned. "I don't follow." "You're burning out the engines," Thomas said, leaning his knuckles on the table. "Look at the turnaround times in Chicago. The software is scheduling drivers for back-to-back 10-hour hauls with only a mandatory 4-hour layover. It's legal, barely, but it's brutal. The drivers are exhausted. When they hit the Chicago yard, they aren't dropping the trailers in the designated bays because they're too damn tired to back a 50-foot rig into a tight spot at 2 in the morning. They're dropping them in the overflow lot and clocking out." Thomas pointed a thick, calloused finger at the scattered papers. "Your yard jockeys are spending 6 hours a shift playing Tetris with drop trailers just to get them to the loading docks. That's your bottleneck. It's not an anomalous volume issue. Your guys on the floor are quitting because you're working them like machines. And machines break when you run them in the red." Richard scoffed, a short, dismissive sound. "With respect, Thomas, you are relying on anecdotal assumptions. Our telemetrics—" "Your telemetrics don't drive in the snow," Thomas interrupted, his voice rising raw and heavy. "You want to fix Chicago? You don't need a software patch. You need to hire 5 more yard drivers, increase the layover mandate to 8 hours, and buy the dock crew decent floodlights so they can actually see the bay numbers at night. You're trying to fix a blown gasket by changing the radio station." Silence descended again, thicker this time. Richard opened his mouth, his face flushing an angry, blotchy red. "Make the calls, Richard." Claire's voice cut through the room. Everyone turned to the CEO. She hadn't moved, but her eyes were locked on Thomas. "Authorize the new hires for the Chicago yard by close of business today," Claire ordered, her tone devoid of emotion, but heavy with absolute authority. "And adjust the routing software to mandate an 8-hour layover. Thomas will oversee the implementation." Richard swallowed hard, the condescension evaporating from his face. "Yes, Claire." Thomas sank slowly back into his ergonomic chair. The adrenaline was draining out of his blood, leaving him slightly dizzy. His hands were shaking underneath the table. He pressed them hard against his thighs to stop the tremors. He looked down the length of the table. Claire met his gaze. She didn't smile. but she gave him a single, deliberate nod. 3 days later, the smell of diesel exhaust and frozen concrete filled Thomas's lungs. It was 2 a.m. at the Chicago hub. The floodlights overhead buzzed with a loud electrical hum, casting harsh white glare over a sea of white semi-trailers. The air was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that seeped through the soles of your boots and nested in your joints. Thomas wasn't wearing a suit. He wore his old canvas jacket, thick denim, and steel-toed boots. He stood on the concrete loading dock, a clipboard in his hand, watching a battered yard truck maneuver a 53-foot trailer perfectly into Bay 4. Beside him stood the night shift dock manager, a heavy-set man named Miller, who smelled intensely of cheap coffee and chewing tobacco. "Got the new lights installed yesterday," Miller grunted, spitting into a paper cup. He looked at Thomas sideways, clearly still suspicious of a corporate suit who actually showed up at 2 in the morning. "Helps. Guys aren't backing into the yellow poles as much." "How's the backlog?" Thomas asked, not taking his eyes off the yard. "Clearing. The extra yard drivers took the pressure off. We're moving freight instead of looking for it." Miller paused, shifting his weight. "You the guy who pushed for the 8-hour sleep mandate?" "Yeah." Miller nodded slowly. "My drivers don't look like walking corpses anymore. Appreciate it." He turned and walked back toward the dispatch office, yelling at a forklift driver to slow down. Thomas stayed on the dock for another hour, letting the chaotic, deafening rhythm of the logistics hub wash over him. It was loud, it was dirty, and it was perfectly, beautifully functional. He realized, with a sudden grounding clarity, that he wasn't an imposter. He just didn't belong in the boardroom. He belonged here, on the floor, translating the friction of the real world for the people in the glass towers. A sleek black town car pulled into the far end of the yard, its headlights cutting through the diesel smog. It idled near the perimeter fence. Thomas walked down the metal stairs of the dock and approached the car. The rear window rolled down. Claire Croft sat in the back seat, a thick wool coat draped over her shoulders. She looked exhausted, the sharp lines of her face softened by the dim interior light. "You didn't have to fly out here," Thomas said, leaning against the cold metal of the doorframe. "I signed off on a $2 million operational shift," Claire replied quietly. "I wanted to see if it worked." "It's working," Thomas said. He gestured toward the line of trucks steadily pulling out of the gates, hitting the highway on schedule. "Blood pressure is down, freight is up." Claire looked out at the massive, floodlit operation. Richard was furious. He threatened to resign. "Let him," Thomas said bluntly. "He's managing a spreadsheet, not a supply chain." Claire let out a short, quiet laugh. It was a surprising sound, dry and genuinely amused. She turned to look at Thomas. The harsh yard lights caught the silver threads in her dark hair. "When I took over this company from my father, I knew the names of every dock manager in the Midwest," she said, her voice dropping into something resembling vulnerability. 5 years in that glass office, and I forgot what diesel smelled like. I forgot that this company is made of metal and rubber and exhausted people, not data points. She looked down at Thomas's hands. The knuckles were still scarred from the radiator fan, marked by thick pink lines of healing tissue. "I was running the engine in the red," she murmured. "You're fixing it," Thomas said. He pushed off the doorframe. "Go back to the hotel, Claire. The machine is humming. I'll see you in the office on Monday." She held his gaze for a long moment. There was a profound, silent weight between them. Not romance, but the deep, rare recognition of two people who understood how hard it was to keep things from falling apart. "Good night, Thomas," she said. The window rolled up, and the town car pulled away into the dark. Saturday morning, sunlight, weak and pale, filtered through the windows of the new apartment. It wasn't a mansion. It was a two-bedroom on the good side of town, with thick walls, clean carpets, and appliances that didn't rattle when they ran. It smelled like fresh paint and the vanilla candles Sadie loved. Thomas sat at the kitchen island, a mug of black coffee in his hand. He wasn't wearing a tie. He wore a faded gray t-shirt and flannel pajama pants. The apartment was completely, blessedly silent, save for the low, steady hum of the central heating unit, pushing warm air through the vents. Sadie padded into the kitchen. She was wearing brand-new, brightly colored socks that slid slightly on the hardwood floor. She climbed onto the stool next to him, dropping a heavily dog-eared coloring book onto the granite counter. "Dad," she said, carefully selecting a bright green crayon. "Can we get pancakes? The big ones with the syrup?" Thomas looked at his daughter. He didn't feel the sudden icy grip of panic in his chest. He didn't have to mentally calculate the cost of a diner breakfast against the electric bill. He didn't have to wonder if his car would start. The math was finally quiet. The engine was fixed. He reached out, resting a heavy, scarred hand on top of her head, smoothing her messy morning hair. "Yeah, Bug," Thomas said, his voice thick with a quiet, overwhelming peace. "We can get whatever you want. Sometimes the universe doesn't send a lifeline. It sends a broken engine on a freezing highway." Thomas risked everything because he couldn't ignore a cry for help, proving the true worth isn't found in a flawless resume, but in the willingness to get your hands dirty when everything falls apart. If this story of grit, consequence, and second chances resonated with you, hit that like button, share it with someone fighting their own battles, and subscribe for more grounded, human stories.